Hi guys, George the Troglodyne here with another of my series about things that you encounter when you're doing interviews and negotiating with clients as to why should they be digging you, man. And one of the common interview questions you get is what is called the time preference question. And it goes essentially like this. You need to tell me about a time where you made short-term sacrifices to get long-term gain. I mean, this should be pretty obvious, but they always will dress it up in some different other way to try and confuse the fact that it's just about we want to find out what your time preference is, right? Because generally any organization that's going to do well and sustainably is going to want to choose people who are willing to sacrifice their short-term interests in the furtherance of long-term goals. Now, I mean, the easiest way to do this would just be, get a credit check on your employees, but that is not legal in some states. So you sort of have to instead talk about all these experiences you've had in your lifetime, right? And again, a credit check wouldn't be perfect, but it is a good analog for whether or not this person has a long term or a short term orientation with regard to their outlook. Uh, One thing that I think is somewhat bad about this question is that when you're dealing with engineers, they're always really emotionally invested in building it right. The good solution, the correct design. We see ourselves as builders, and we want to build something that can last the test of time. But in my experiences, QA and testing, the fact that you need to report information to stakeholders so that they can make better decisions actually gives you a little bit more perspective on this, in that it turns out what you don't actually want most of the time is this perfect, very well built system. Actually, what the customer generally wants is Mr. Right now, not Mr. Right. So that is the big problem with this question, is that uh, yeah, I can make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains, but a lot of times that's actually not what you want in a business environment. In fact, you do need to make those short-term sacrifices so that you can get the long-term gain, but not the ones you're thinking of, e.g., I made a slapdash system that satisfied customer needs. Yeah, it's short term from a design point of view, but it's actually long term thinking from a customer acquisition and retention point of view. And so it really comes down to how are you looking at this, which actually makes the question a lot easier to answer than some people think, because it's really just a matter of framing the scenario such that it will match what they're looking for. So it depends on the mindset of the organization. If it's an engineering driven firm, they're going to want the answer that is from the technical point of view with regard to, I decided that I was, for example, going to embrace this other technology that was a little harder to use but had the better flexibility that I needed to solve the general case rather than solving the specific case for my customer, right? Well, if it's a customer focused organization, then that's going to be very different. They're going to actually more think about, well, we went and made the hard decisions to cut these corners that the customer didn't care about. And we paid the long term cost to do that because it was worth acquiring customers in the short term. Both of those are short term sacrifices for long term gain, and because the thing is, you're going to be paying the technical debt sooner than you think whenever you deal with a thing like that. And by what I mean by technical debt is I chose a design that couldn't fully satisfy the general case of what the customer wanted, right? And generally, the way software development works now, because of this reality and of most firms getting much more closely connected to the customer rather than the engineering discipline, uh, it's basically a question of we need to tighten up our OODA loop with the customer. And, that's a military slang, but the business version of it is called OPS-CDA, but it's basically just observe, orient, decide, act, right? And so the part that most engineers fail the worst on, and most organizations fail the worst on, is observation, because that's the key part that tells you whether or not you're succeeding or failing whenever you go to the subsequent orientation step. So you have to sample the reaction to whatever your latest iteration of the software you're working on is. And that way you can then refine it and deal with adding or subtracting constraints to the program execution, and then adjusting your schedule as is necessary. And then you go ahead and you decide what you're going to do, which is, I'm going to choose this algorithm or that algorithm. And then putting it into practice is just going ahead, testing it, annealing it for performance, and getting it out the door with the correct hooks in, so that you can actually observe what happened. Now, the follow-up questions to this original time preference question actually drives at what they're trying to get at as a firm, because it's almost always like, how do you drive adoption? How do you measure adoption of these things that you're working on? E.g., what's the long-term goal? Well, how do you know you actually achieved it, right? And how do you know that the short-term sacrifices you made actually were worth it? Well, that's going to be all about that observation step. Like I said, most organizations, they really fail this very badly. Some of it's for reasons of organizational pathology, in that, hey, if I never look for failures, I never fail. Yay! But sometimes it's just because it's actually a hard problem. Things like web analytics, all that stuff, it doesn't come for free, and it takes a lot of work to actually set up right. And the whole domain of information retrieval can make it somewhat daunting, especially when there's a lot of parameters that you want to keep track of with regard to what your customers are doing. Sometimes it's actually not just like customer liked this feature or that feature. It's more like, customer went through X steps, X action chains. Here's sort of like the general action chains they do, and here's the change in behavior. And does this actually correlate with the time we released our software, or was it actually some other feature that made it to where these two things synergized? You see where I'm going with this? It's actually a complex discipline to do right. So that's another reason a lot of times people don't do it correctly. And that's really what they're looking for. And the whole thing about driving adoption, again, engineers really are usually bad about this, because they're also usually really bad about human nature and not taking the lessons you have from software and applying them into the non-programming world. Because driving adoption is just marketing, right? And marketing, fundamentally, from a high level view, is actually just tree search. It's going to be either a depth first or a breadth first search of a tree of different leads, right? In that they're sort of going to, especially like, for example, the Facebook way of reaching customers is probably the best online advertising that there is. It's going to be either that or Google. But the point is, both of them you sort of like give a set of keywords to, and then it's you sort of walk down that to see, okay, well, I want them to have this keyword and this keyword, or I want them to have this keyword and this keyword, and you go down the list like that, just sort of filtering down through a tree of connections of people. And you can also instead go, from the bottom up, rather than from the top, saying, well, here's the things I want from the customer. Let's go and see if they have this one. Then we'll go and take out this one that doesn't have this other one. That recursive descent kind of stuff. But what you can also do is you can go from the very bottom, of that approach, and say, okay, well, how about we just find somebody who has every one of these tags, and throw everyone else out? Well, it turns out that just doesn't give you enough results. So it usually what we end up doing is this sort of like, we're trying to find people who hit the most partials of the tags that we're actually looking for. And some of it is going to also be about like, who am I targeting? So, like I said, it's just a matter of like finding the tags with the people. But the different people you attack also has sort of a relationship to this breadth first versus depth first. When you think about it from an organizational point of view, because you can basically, either you can infect the sheep or you can convert the shepherd, right? When you're doing B2B, generally you're going to be talking to the people who have power to actually get stuff done in organizations, which is going to be the hiring managers, the people who have budgets to spend, all that kind of stuff. So usually you're going to want to actually go after the shepherds, shall we say, and go from there, which means that getting their attention is a very different sort of affair than getting the attention of the worker, for example, who the target end user actually of the software is. But there is also something to be said to be going directly to the customer, especially if it has wide appeal, because the total revenue you're going to get from that is so much higher. But the total cost outlays to get there are also really a lot higher. So when you see a lot of the startup guys in advice as to, well, what do I choose as my product? Almost always they're going to say go B2B because it's just so much easier to bootstrap that because just to reach the hiring managers and stuff like that, most of the time it's just a matter of, I set up a booth at a conference and they came here and they said, wow, this thing fixed all my problems. So marketing is a lot cheaper the less actual targets you have, the less hits you're going to get with whatever your search, your information retrieval technique you're going to use is. Uh, and that's generally how it goes. You're either going to get a lot of spam and false positives and waste a lot of money on that, making your marketing costs go up, or you're going to spend small targeted amounts on the various people that you want to get, but that takes a lot more research up front for you to find out, well, where are these guys? Who are these guys? How do we get into their inbox? All that kind of stuff. So internally, when you're trying to sell something, it's a little bit different. Uh, in that case, a lot of times it's actually easier to sell things directly to your coworkers rather than sell them to your boss, especially because your boss is naturally going to see the risks before he sees the rewards. Because number one, he's already got some other stuff he wants you to do, and number two, the productivity benefits of like an internal tool, they're entirely theoretical until you see them. And if they really wanted it, they would have been asking you to do it, right? They can't sort of be in touch with what's actually going on the production line the same way that the actual workers can. And I think this is why a lot of the stuff like Kaizen has evolved over the years, where it's about empowering the worker directly to get these sort of obstacles, excuse me, out of the way of the production process themselves rather than waiting on management unless literally money is required to solve the problem. And a lot of times, the best role for management in this is actually to sort of allow this institutional selling sort of in between employees to try and figure out what's best and what's not, and periodically go through and then say, well, what's working here and what's not working here, and let's spread what's working to the rest of the organization and not do what is not working with regard to our own sort of internal development. A lot of times it's like a 20% time to try and make yourself more productive. Uh, and that's about the best we can do. Uh, so aside from that, I'll revisit the question of how we measure stuff, but I will sort of talk about selling all the things that I've done in my own life, especially since most of what I've done is selling internal tools throughout my career, but I've also sold external tools, especially when I was doing the startup stuff at Hailstrike. And just to get you an idea of what you're selling when you're doing QA, which, like I said, I did for 10 years, uh, you're selling strategic intelligence to decision makers so that they can go and make decisions better. Which a lot of times it's like, okay, so why should they trust you? What is the information they're looking for? Those are the sort of things that you need to have for it to have selling power and thus make a good impact on the organization. And that's the whole idea, is that it needs to be impactful for the organization. And that's where things like writing good bugs, writing good reports, all that stuff comes into play. You can't ignore the principles of good writing. You can't ignore a lot of these human nature things. Otherwise, you're going to write a report that gets ignored, and then the organization fails. And guess who it's blamed on? Not the person who didn't read the report because it was too wordy. So when it comes to selling directly to customers, I had this one time where a guy calls us up, okay, and he's a customer, for these hail reports and stuff like that, and he's saying, "Oh man, I got this report that it says there's hail here, and I don't see hail damage on the roof, all that kind of stuff, right?" And so I went and investigated it, and it looks like the code that had been written in the early days of the startup was not actually accounting for projection. So whenever you have anything inside of a database that is representing geometry, you have to understand, especially like on the Earth, it's projected onto another surface. In the case of the Earth, an oblate spheroid. And if you don't correct for this is a thing in a 2D plane that's being stored in the database and then project it onto this, you're going to get a wildly bogus sort of thing. And the way that we were doing it on the map was we were the projection that the map in the that we were loading, I believe it was Mapbox, was not the same as the projection we were actually doing when we were doing our in database, whether this is in here or not, and then displaying the rasters over the map. So I had to go in, I had to make sure that the projections were identical, I had to check them, I had to make sure that they were good at all latitudes, all that kind of stuff. But I got it done within about a week or so, and we had a happy customer. That was really early on in the business, and it's kind of funny with regard to startup stuff. You can be wildly wrong like that and still get subscribers. It's sort of one of those things that's like, it's the real selling case for Mr. Right Now, in that even though it was wrong in some places, it was good enough, for especially the latitude where we had the most customers, just because that was sort of how, my cousin had fiddled with it to where it looked like it worked, around the Dallas Fort Worth area where we were originally selling it. But anyways, we are later in the business. It was more little things like customers calling up and saying, hey, salesman promised me this, I couldn't actually do this. And in those cases, a lot of times it was actually like really simple. Like there was this one time where uh, he wanted us to export some stuff in bulk, like into Excel or something like that, because the tool just didn't do that. And he saw no way to actually export in bulk so he could do that. So, I'd just done some optimizations to where this wouldn't like kill the system. So I whipped up an API real quick, hooked him up, hooked it up to Excel. Everybody was a happy camper. And then we had that mainlined into the app itself within a week or so. So it's just a matter of when it comes to dealing directly with customers, it's sort of the old formula with regard to in customer service as well. There's basically two books that guided me. I read at the time. It was Carl Sewell's Customers for Life, which basically the big deal is with a sales and customer support organization, never, ever, ever, ever over promise. What you do is over deliver. Okay, you make sure that whatever it is that they need to solve their problem, that you're never going to tell them ever that you're going to do something that you can't or you won't. And that was one problem with the sales organization there at Hailstrike, was that they played a little fast and loose, and I had to sort of rein them in to prevent them from doing that. And I passed around copies of Sewell's book until they got the message. And then the other half of that was uh, uh, The Secret to Selling Anything by Harry Brown, I believe. And it is essentially that selling is simply a proposition of what do you need, and I am here to help you. It's not this idea of like necessitousness, like I need to sell this thing, I need to make money. The customer does not care about you and your motivations. They care about them and their motivations. And what you need to do is you need to get inside their head and start to feel the way they feel, and start to think about, well, if I had this problem, how would I help it, and how would I use my product to help that? And if your product doesn't help them with that, you need to be straight up and tell them, that this isn't going to help you, but I think this might, maybe, or I think that this other thing might, or that I don't even know the answer to that question. But being real with them and being upfront is going to a lot of times actually get you a client, because they're going to be like, well, this isn't my problem right now, but I also do have the problem you do solve every now and then. And, we'll go from there. And they want to deal with honest brokers. So But the point is, you want people to be happy campers. You want them to have positive interactions with you with regard to getting all that done. And this is also true when you are dealing with internal selling. You can't overpromise. You can't underdeliver. You have to do these sorts of things just like it's any other sales job. It's pretty much the same. It's just a matter of who are you targeting. Usually is what is the primary difference. But the actual selling and the customer service, that's always the same sort of thing. Now, on the other hand, just getting back sort of into war stories, uh, when I was at CPAN, we had this sort of before the days of really good container orchestration or even really good VM orchestration. That was sort of the problem we had to solve was how to spin up a lot of VMs so we could do a lot of acceptance testing against them, right? So a lot of it was Selenium, things like that, which given my expertise, it should shock no one. But over the years, as a lot of these open source off the shelf tools improved, we wanted to overcome the shortcomings of the systems that we built, which at the time they were basically contemporaries and growing up roughly around the same time. AWS and a lot of these other systems like Salt, and now there's tons of them like Kubernetes, OpenStack, you name it. Um, but those didn't exist at the time, or the ones that did exist were more like individual machine configuration management. They just weren't to the multiple machine orchestration to satisfy a workload level yet. And so that's what we built sort of manually. And we also bolted on basically like a test management system to it because we're testers. And of course, that's what we do, right? So when I came back to cPanel after the startup experience, what I did was I figured out that there was a good way to replace almost all this stuff with off the shelf stuff, cut out a lot of code and get a lot more features. So that was basically the selling point I had to them. And especially since the hardware that we'd installed the original system on was pretty much crapping out, and I was the only guy left that had any hand whatsoever in the old code base. So, it was sort of a fait accompli with regard to, replacing it. So it was sort of a combination of right place at the right time, but also, having a clear path to a better system. And, it took about 6 months before I had, everything plumbed back up together, but it was all working again. And we ended up extending and extending and extending. And eventually I built an interface because the interface for OpenStack was just not great. And that's what we ended up using as our VM orchestration service. And, but even then, I was still ahead of my time in some ways. And now it turns out that had I done it today, I would have used something like Terraform or Kubernetes or something like that, right? But that's the point, is that it's just sort of like you have to see that there are always systems that are used to solve problems, and there's always a way you can improve on it. And that's the way you have to sell with regard to second mover solutions, even if they're internal or external. And the next thing that you have to think about is measuring the adoption of your stuff, checking how well your marketing is working, all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, there's really, really good tools with regard to if you're selling directly to customers, if you're using standard advertising channels like Google or Facebook. And on the other hand, when you're doing things internally, when you're doing things like direct sales of actual physical goods, things can get a lot more complicated because it's like, well, I sold it, but did they use it? Right? And how are they using it? That's one thing that is really nice about digital software products is that you actually can get that information as to, well, how are the users using it? And that's how you figure out, well, it turns out they're not using it the way you thought they were going to use it at all. And now it turns out you could make their experience a lot better thanks to knowing how they're actually using it. And so the best help that I can think of with regard to all of that sort of stuff is that it's going to be one of two techniques. And the digital is basically you're gonna have to phone home or you're gonna have to knock on the door, right? Uh, and when you have to knock out on the door, when you go out of your way to go and find customer information, it's going to almost immediately be bogus, okay? Because what people are going to tell you is whatever gets you out of their face the fastest as possible, as opposed to if you have the product itself phoning home and telling you what you need to know instead of what you want to hear or what the customer just says to get you away from them as soon as they can. That's going to be a lot more useful to you, obviously. So that's probably the answer that people are looking for on interviews and stuff, especially in engineering organizations. And thanks to stuff like Internet of Things, this is increasingly becoming the answer for normal, actual physical products. So to tie it all sort of back together, the original question was basically one of like time preference, and so uh, here's my answer. I'm doing it right now, right? I'm sacrificing my short term gain that I could have by working for some other party, right? By building these videos, building this reputation, working on a software product that is not paying off right now very much, but it can down the road. And if I keep working at it and I keep consistent, it'll eventually pay off. And that's the sort of thing that I've tried to have in my whole life, in that whatever I'm pursuing, excuse me, it has to satisfy multiple possible angles, right? In that, suppose that this micro ISV thing doesn't work out. Well, it turns out building the reputation and doing the blogging and doing the videos is actually going to help me get hired and help me build a reputation and get hired for more money. So, that's the way you have to sort of build things, is such that nothing is actually a total loss. And that's sort of it's a modified approach to the normal investing philosophy of like the Kelly criterion, in that you never invest too much in one thing. You never go all in, if you want to actually grow wealth in the way that you need to. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not going all in on, being a salary man or doing contracts or being an ISV or uh, doing this whole like reputation management. I'm not going all in on any of those. I'm chasing all of them at the same time through very careful selection of what it is I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So that's the way I would suggest people do that. And from a technical, anyways, the big deal here is that what people are looking for is they don't want to see you make a big ball of mud. And what they want you to do instead is make a good and right system, when a lot of times that's not the option. But, it's an interview, so everything's aspirational, right? Engineers are going to go with what's called a creationist solution, which is the engineering solution, that I described earlier in this video. And sometimes you can actually get away with that. A good way to show that off is open source projects. And I think my work on Selenium Client, when contrasted with Selenium Remote Driver, is literally the poster child for this, in that Selenium Client has not got a lot of the sugar that Selenium Remote Driver has. But on the other hand, it works a lot better. It's a lot easier to maintain because I chose a good design up front. I've got a lot of experience with these sorts of dynamics at cPanel as well, because they're a big mono repo basically. And we had a lot of projects there that were basically, let's rewrite it again, but do it right this time. And inevitably those failed because uh, you always forget the reason you wrote something that way the first time you tried. Excuse me. You always forget the concerns that led up to you writing a system in the way that it was when it's a big ball of mud, because it's essentially an evolutionary design. It's more of an accretion disk around customer requirements, which were, if they're written down at all, were not done well. So you sort of have to do a lot of archaeology. You have to discover what the system itself does before you even think about redesigning it. And a lot of times you just don't have the time to do that. And what you end up creating is something that doesn't satisfy the customer and just ticks them off for no reason. When what you could have done was just leave good enough as is, or decide to choose to make little surgical edits, minimally invasive procedures. A lot of times software is a lot like that sort of doctor's maxim, in that the whole chance to cut is a chance to cure. Well, it's also a chance to kill. So conservatism with regard to dealing with legacy systems is always very, very much indicated. So let's see. Yeah, best advice I have for that practically, for trying to get a solution that meets the sort of design requirements, but without actually rewriting everything. What you actually want to do is you want to break up the monolith, or break the system such that adding new components is essentially like a plugin, that you sort of limit the damage based on bad design to that, and you can have whatever you bolt on actually be done correctly. That's generally the way you want to go with it. And that's sort of what service oriented architecture is really about. It's about pluggability, it's about interoperability, and that's really what most good designs at the end of the day are, is making sure that you can leverage that sort of modularity to great effect, because customers are always going to have lots of different requirements. And if you make it to where it's pluggable, composable, all that stuff, you can make sure that every single little component actually has good design, rather than sort of get shoehorned into the iron bed that the existing design sets you to be in. So that's what I got for today. Hope you guys have a good one, and see you later.